especially Wits Press, for bringing this book to life. It's been a long project, it's been a long journey. It's taken us 5 years almost, 4.5 years to get here. But before I get into that, I'll come back to that in a moment. I want to start by saying, Veronica has talked about state capture as a political project. But what I want to do slightly differently here, maybe Peter will pick up on this, is that state capture, the term, has also become a metaphor in many ways. That's my literary background coming out there. In that it has become something that captures, did I just say captures, a lot about our society that we still need to make sense of. Inequality, the exercise of public power, corruption, but also a lot that ranges across disciplines when we think about an academic project like this book, history, sociology, the political economy of South Africa. It is used in a variety of ways, my favorite of which is the way it's used as an insult directed at any political opponent who holds state power. But I'm going to ask some of our panelists in a moment to tell us what they mean by state capture. The genesis of the metaphor, I think, as Veronica has said, was in the State of Capture report in 2016. That very important report by former public protector, Mbongiseni. It was followed, of course, by a number of analyses, one of which we were involved in at PARI, a report published in 2017 called Betrayal of the Promise, How South Africa is Being Stolen. Of course, we followed up on this with conferences as well. So while doing the analysis, one of the things we've also been doing alongside this is working with other people in civil society, is to think about how do we respond? How do we respond as society? How do we respond as civil society organizations? How do we push back? Right? And we were involved in a lot of the mobilization. A lot of organizations in civil society were involved in the mobilization. Jonathan Klaaren's chapter talks a bit about some of the mobilization and the way in which law was used. We'll tell us about that later on. Those conferences, this book in particular comes out of a conference we hosted in 2018. It was titled After Capture, State Capture and Its Aftermath, which was then subsequently followed by another conference in 2019 and another one that we hosted last year. We're hosting a follow-up later on in October this year, where we're thinking about the findings of the Zondo Commission. We're thinking about why the state has been so slow in implementing some of those findings, and what we can do as civil society to put pressure on those who hold public power to implement some of those findings. Okay, not all of them are great findings, should not all be implemented. And the last day's conference was about, in fact, critiquing those findings of the Commission and its recommendations. Devi Pillay was a researcher in the Commission, and we may ask her a little bit later on to say a few words about the Commission. But let me then turn over to the running order of this evening. We have 3 panelists, we have the co-editors. I'm going to ask Peter Vale, co-editor of this book, to give a little bit of an overview of the book, followed by more in-depth discussions in which I'm going to pose a question to each of the 3 contributors to the book, ask them to talk about their chapters. And we're going to do that very briefly and then open up for discussion with all of you. So once again, thank you for being here tonight. Let me invite Peter to give us an overview of the book.
Thanks very much. The first point I want to make is that the original title of this book was, wait for it, State Capture in South Africa, Conceptual and Comparative Understandings. And it's thanks to the genius of Wits Press that we realized we had a book that was academic, intellectual, but accessible, and was actually answering a lot of questions in the here and now. And that's why this title, I think, How and Why It Happened, is not only a marketing title, but a best description of what the book is. So, let me say that the state capture volume has 3 sections and an introduction. And the introduction has been touched on a little bit by Mbongiseni. And then it has 3 series, 3 sections: framing the issue, state capture in action, past and future. Let me just talk very briefly about what's in it. The first, framing the issue, is quite academic and conceptual and theoretical, but it's a wonderful example in the middle of this of a practical person's guide to state capture. And there's one chapter by Robin Foley who talks about critical theory and stuff like that, and then suddenly presents what I've called a simple person's understanding of state capture in the form of diagrams that would make it completely accessible to the man in the street or the person in the street of what state capture is. The theoretical parts are not heavy going. The theoretical parts are largely accessible, but they're very rich. And if I tell you, one was written by Carl van Holt, who's an eminent sociologist and talks about violence in the making of the South African state and the post-apartheid state, you'll get an idea. One is by Ryan Brunette, and the third is Robin Foley. The second section is state capture in action, and here you've got 3 of the contributors to that section. And what we try to do is give an idea of encounters with state capture, the fight back against state capture in a practical way. There's one person who's not here, Luke Stradopoulos, and he wrote a very good chapter which he reported interviews that were done with NGOs, and it's a very interesting chapter. The past and future, which is the third section, has 3 chapters and an interview, and I want to spend a little time on these 3 chapters. The first one is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, who's now built a career in television, or was building a career in television. And what we asked him to do was to try and understand culture and state capture. And this is a wonderful example, I think, of how culture and politics get intertwined together. And he's looked at state capture through film, through painting, and through rap music. It's quite a unique chapter. I've never seen discussion of South African politics through those prisms. So I think it breaks entirely new ground, as indeed do the other chapters. The second one is a repeat of an old theme in South African politics, and that theme is arms sales, capturing the state through arms sales and sanctions. And that is by Henny van Vuren and Michael Marchant. And I think it's a good, up-to-date expose of how state capture has been a continuous form, a continuous factor inside the building of the South African state. This is then reinforced by an interview which Mbongiseni and I did with Barney Pityana. And it's Barney has a long optic, a long view, a long telegraphic view. That's a contradiction of terms. A long telescope view of state capture, starting with Van Riebeck, pre-Van Riebeck, right through the National Party, and he doesn't spare at all the post-apartheid state capture in that. And we were hoping Barney would be here tonight. Unfortunately, he can't be here, but it's a chapter worthwhile doing. And then finally, the final chapter is the comparative piece that Mbongiseni and I wanted so desperately in the beginning. Patrick Hiller, who's in the US, Brown University, wrote a chapter comparing India, Brazil, and South Africa. 3 countries who have gone through more or less the same, shall we say, unhappy experience. Let me just say 1 or 2 other words about the book itself. I think this book sets an agenda for the future, because it seems to me But this is not the end of the discussion on state capture, it's the beginning of the discussion on state capture. Not only its use as a metaphor, but its use in the way that we understand it. And I think this book and conversations like this are the beginning of a long search inside South Africa for understanding a dialogue that has to happen on the state of our country. And this book should be seen, I think, as part of the contribution to that dialogue. Thanks a lot.
Let's start with Devi Pillay. Devi Pillay is my colleague. She's a researcher at PARI, who was, as I said earlier, a researcher and an analyst for the Zondo Commission. Her work is across anthropology, history, and historiography of the state and its relationship with other institutions. And the question I want to ask her, so Devi's contribution is written, co-authored with another person in the room who I'm going to out, if I can see her, Sharice Kapoor, there she is, on professions and professionals and how they aided state capture. But before I get to the question of professions and professionals, Devi, I want to ask you to give us, perhaps all within the Commission, what is the definition of state capture that the Zondo Commission was working with? And what are its limitations? And then from there, let me just pose the second question, which is, so tell us about how professionals aided the state capture. So the microphone has just gone off.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. First question about the definition of state capture. Well, as the book will show you, it's a contested term with many meanings. I think that is part of the problem that faced the Commission in that its terms of reference, and you must remember this is a very legalistic institution that is bound to follow those terms of reference, charged it to investigate state capture but never defined the term. And there being no legal reality of state capture in South Africa left the Commission in a quandary. The direction that the Commission decided to go in the end was to do a sort of bottom-up analysis of all of the evidence afterwards. So they called in a couple of experts at the beginning, people who had done work on state capture in other contexts, heard from them, looked at all of the evidence, and I think essentially what the Commission did in the end, it is a chapter in the report, it's not one I've seen widely discussed or widely cited, was to say, well, we have found a discrete pattern of behavior here. We have found something that looks to us to be distinguishable from other types of corruption that have been identified in the state. Here are the different elements in that project, as they like to call it, and the name that we'll give to this thing is state capture. So in a sort of roundabout way, the Commission looked at the evidence and then arrived at an understanding of what state capture might be, instead of the other way around. And its eventual definition was something that I think is quite familiar to people who use the term colloquially once you think about it, in that state capture is a project or projects enacted by multiple overlapping networks of actors inside and outside of the state who cooperate to subvert the constitutional order, to extract rents from state institutions for private gain, and also, and this is an important thing that's often not recognized, although it is in the Commission's definition, to secure political power. It's not purely for monetary effort. This definition has limitations, part of which is that because the Commission created the definition itself, it is still sort of contestable, and it is contested. And the way that the Commission reached this definition is itself a matter of debate, as we see now being very fervently debated in the political realm. It's also quite a technical definition that sort of focuses on describing behaviors of actors, and it doesn't have much historical, political depth to it. That's some of the conceptual understandings that you may find in work, for example, in the book that we're discussing today. Should I move on?
Let's move on here too.
Okay, the role of professionals. I've been told I must keep it brief. So the first question is like, why would we look at professionals? And by professionals here, there's a lot of definitions we could go into, sociology professions and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, we're looking at individuals with specific expertise, with technical autonomy, with a degree of status, a high degree of financial rewards. There's like regulated entry, like exams and licensing into these professions. Generally speaking about lawyers, auditors, accountants, that kind of thing. There's also a category of professionals that don't quite meet the traditional definitions, like PR representatives, for example, or management consultants, and we have addressed them in this book as well. The reason they're interesting to look at is there's three reasons. The first is that they have a specific role in a project of state capture as identified by the Commission, or as identified by other people working in the field. They have a role to play in this chain that is distinct from that of, say, people within the state or private companies who are profiting from contracts. The second reason they're interesting is because they have been massive beneficiaries of illegal contracts and so on and so forth. I mean, if you look at what some of the politicians got, it's peanuts compared to the money that Deloitte and McKinsey and KPMG were making. The third reason it's interesting is because it prompts us to look more closely at the relationship between the state and private service providers, and that has broader consequences for us going forward. So the role played by professionals in state capture is interesting. Firstly, they were beneficiaries. They made a lot of money from these contracts. That's similar to how other private companies like, say, SAP were able to get inflated contracts and pay kickbacks. But as enablers, they use their specific skills in order to perpetrate corruption and to facilitate a project of state capture. And for example, we can see this clearly when lawyers use their expertise and their status to use the legal systems to protect people from accountability, or to use their forensic firms to target enemies of the perpetrators of state capture. We see it when auditors assist companies in hiding or laundering money, or provide advice for tax evasion. We can see it when management consultants give financial advice on transactions that actually hurt your state-owned entity in order to benefit a third party. You can see it in the behavior of Bain when restructuring SARS, again for third-party benefit and not in the best interest of the state. All of this is about the use of their status and their skills and the specific role that they play as consultants and service providers to the state, and how they're able to leverage these positions in order to perpetrate corruption and state capture. Moreover, professional firms, because of their status, lend a legitimation to a lot of these activities that otherwise might throw up immediate, obvious red flags and allow these to continue behind closed doors. They also operate with a level of confidentiality, non-disclosure agreements as sort of their matter of course, which again kind of hinders transparency that we would expect to see in decisions made by the state. And lastly, there's an inherent conflict of interest in a lot of the work that these professionals are undertaking for the state. They give the state advice that results in them being given more work, or their auditing arm of all service firms, for example, like KPMG or Deloitte, it's supposed to be providing checks and balances to a company. It's supposed to be providing checks and balances to a company, while at the same time doing highly lucrative work with other parts of their firm, which disincentivizes them from doing their jobs. So I could go into a lot of examples, but I'm going to leave that. I think overall, what are we suggesting at the end of this chapter? Well, there's a lot to be said about like ethics standards and training and professional bodies, so on and so forth, about sanctions, about the importance of consequences. But I think the point that I really want to make is that we really need to be rethinking the relationship of the state to these private professional service providers, in thinking about what kind of professional work do we outsource and why are we outsourcing so much of it? Because a lot of parts of our state and partly as a consequence of state capture, have been left devoid of professional expertise. Moreover, when the state ends up outsourcing so much of this critical professional work, it is contract management becomes a vital part of state work. And we were seeing in state capture that a lot of people within the state aren't able to manage these contracts, aren't able to assess the quality of that work, aren't able to properly evaluate whether you should continue, for example, hiring these professional service providers. And we shouldn't forget that many people within the state, bureaucrats, technocrats, are professionals themselves. And that creates another interesting dimension for us to consider how those professionals should be governed, regulated, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to take too much time, so I'm going to leave it there, and we'll have you take any questions later.
So, with all due apologies to lawyers and accountants, the professionals who we're not talking about you. Let's move on to a lawyer on the panel. Jonathan Klaaren, who's a professor of law at Wits University. And among other things, used to be, previously was Dean of the Faculty of Law. And he was also an acting judge of the High Court at some point. His chapter is about the use of law to fight back. And so Jonathan, tell us about the nature of the fight back and how law was used, in fact, to fight back against some of this.
Okay, that's what you said in 2018. So let me just say two things before I kind of get into that. And I won't do the sort of lawyers are good after this. But I think there's a lot of great internal conversations within this book, and that's one of the really good parts about it. Two small points. One is just to say, because I've got the microphone and I'm allowed to do it, that I really enjoyed working with the editorial team here, Mbongiseni and many others at PARI, and then over 4.5 years, you can get to know an editor, even during COVID, so Peter, I really enjoyed that. And very much appreciate the fact that Wits University Press is our publisher, etc. The second point is, and I think actually Mbongiseni and Peter have not highlighted it, but I actually think there's a chapter, the introduction in this book, that is pretty much worth the price of admission itself. And I've already begun to use that piece in some of work that will build, I think, from this important book. But it's really one that pulls some historical strands together, cultural strands together. I think really puts this South African story into an African paradigm and context, and a global one at the same time. And I really don't see, been around in academia for a while, and I really don't see work like that all the time, and I think that introductory chapter really deserves to be highlighted on its own as well. Okay, so then answer the question, right? That's what I'm supposed to do. So I guess with my chapter, it in a way tries to answer, it has two answers to that question. So I probably shouldn't get too high marks if I were marking this as an essay. But the first part engages with, I think, the character of constitutionalism. So it really, we're talking here about what the meanings of state capture are. We're talking about metaphor, we're talking about contested concepts. And I think the first part of the chapter begins to understand that state capture in this sense is an episode in what will actually be called by many different names. One way of looking at it is the difference between or maybe not the difference, but the interaction between what you could call a constitutional state and a shadow state. And I think when you really begin to look at those ideas of constitution and shadow, you can read them entirely as white and black, but as Mbongiseni is alluding to, there are other shades of gray and color and etc. etc. in there. And so I think I actually, in a way, wish that I could have pulled more of that out in the chapter, but I think the chapter does do that. So an answer, in part, is that state capture is an episode in this contestation between a constitutional state and a shadow state. That really wasn't what we started with, and what the main part of the chapter that I've got, which is entitled Legal Mobilization Against State Capture. I do remember in that initial conference having for myself, and really I think for all of us, precisely the question that we're being posed now, which is what is state capture? But I knew there was legal mobilization against state capture. That was very clear. And I don't want to set up an opposition with Devi, but I was, and precisely I was, I think to some extent aware and not wishing to tell a kind of hero tale of lawyers and the judiciary, and I don't think this is. But what the chapter goes through and does is, in this part, pretty much do 3 steps. The first is to chronicle, to describe, and others have also done this as well, some of the important litigation that happened. So the 2 strands that I picked out to work with were the series of court cases, Sussman Foundation, CASAC, etc. And the other line, which I think to some extent all of us in this room were participants in, was the social grants, the SASA, the fact that there was a constitutional court national hearing. Some people were talking about it as a panic or as a constitutional crisis, but that idea that for a while it looked as if there was a possibility of social grants not being paid. And I think there was a real social, a real interaction from the entire society about that, I think at a very deep constitutional level. So those were the 2 specific lines of litigation that are in there. And then I went a little bit deeper into that to try to talk about the support structures that are there. Because, don't get me wrong, lawyers are great. And I appreciate it when lawyers get paid and our graduates get work, and etc. But there really is a network there around that litigation. So it is easy, Reg, this may go to you from the media occasionally, to pull out lawyers, as the person, but it fits within the network there. And I made some observations about how there appeared to be a new generation of what we might call public interest lawyers who were coming forward. And then the last part was to kind of take that back a theoretical point and to engage with some literature and to say, well, what's really going on here is something different than strategic litigation. It's really more in this historical, ongoing, contested, cultural sense where the implementation of a court decision is not a simple matter of a judge says, do this, and a state official does that. First of all, we know that that actually doesn't always happen, right? Even though it should. But more importantly, I think you can see that it really happens through the work of more than the legal professional, more than the state official. It's journalists, it's social workers, it's ordinary persons, it's understanding the meanings that are happening there. It's really professionals and civil society. So I think that's what this chapter tries to do, broaden out from that more narrow public interest strategic litigation to a more social civil society vision. And it was a real pleasure to do it, so thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let's now come to Reg. We struggled, and as they often say, the first draft of history is written by a journalist. We struggled for a long time to make sense of what was happening. Partly because as much as there were people writing, exposing what was happening, there are also people writing, countering that with what has come to be known as fake news. And Reg's chapter is on is titled media capture. So Reg, what do you mean by media capture and what happened? Who was fighting back?
Now, I'll give you a tip which might, I'll give you all a tip which might stand in good stead in the future if you're ever on TV and you're being interviewed and somebody asks you a question, you say, that's a very important and interesting question. And I'll get back to it in a moment. But first, I'd like to tell you about my party's policies or whatever. But anyway, that is the key, in fact. And I suppose, should have spent more time in the chapter actually defining what media capture is. So let me tell you what it is. It is and I call it, the title of the chapter is Media Capture, a mirror of state capture. So I don't know if you can really effect proper state capture without media capture. As long as there is this dissent, real dissent, and a means of people knowing what is going on, I don't think you can do that. And what that means is controlling the mass media, basically. And it's not just outright control through censorship or the kind of Soviet-style control we have, or even, and this is an important thing, it's not controlled through violence necessarily. It's control that is exercised in a way that preserves a guise of democracy. So there's a veneer of democracy. You could say, we have a robust media. We don't, and really the term media capture, I think, was originally come up with in relation to Hungary, which says this. Look, we don't kill or imprison journalists, but they have effectively taken over the narrative and shaped it to their own ends. And it's done in a very clever way. And the Guptas, I think, did try to do this. So what are the elements of media capture? Well, one of the elements of media capture is the use of state advertising to intimidate, really, or to starve independent outlets so that they fail or toe the line. You'll see this in Africa quite a lot, actually. You see it next door. I was told in, I won't go into detail, but in various African states this is the case. If you don't get government advertising, if there's no vibrant private sector, then you're finished. So you use state advertising as a tool. Ownership structures. So you arrange to have media outlets apparently owned by the private sector, but they're actually owned either by the state secretly or by people friendly to the state. We had an example of this in the 70s, actually, with the launching of the Citizen newspaper, which was supposedly privately owned by a guy called Louis Late, but was actually funded by the state. It was actually a state newspaper. So you do it through media, often opaque media structures, state advertising. What are the other ways? You can, in fact I wrote them down, sorry. My memory isn't what it was. But it is important because it is in these areas that the Guptas actually failed. And the Hungarian state has succeeded. Yes, use the law. Okay, so you use the law to fine companies where you have something like a media appeals tribunal. Or you use the law, legal things like tax avoidance, real or spurious, to drive people out of business. But you use the law. And then you cancel the licenses of those who don't fall into line. You state capture to cancel the licenses. Not possible in South Africa because your cars are easily dependent. And you don't need a license to launch a newspaper or run a newspaper. And in our case with ownership, it has been transparent, and I, in fact, will continue to be so because the pressures for transparency and ownership have actually grown. And I hope they cover all companies, but certainly I've been an advocate of absolute transparency of ownership of media companies. And we have a very vibrant private sector here, which doesn't rely entirely on state advertising. So that you can't starve independent media outlets. Moreover, we have a donor-funded media, and part of that donor-funded media are actually funded by contributions by individuals. So, you know, that's a big plus. But of course, you can always get rid of that by banning donor-funded media, as India has done, destroying large chunks of your dissenting voices. So that really is the main elements of media capture. And you do it too so that you can only have one narrative. So you can have a few dissenting voices as long as they're on the margin, because then you can say, look, there's no censorship here. You can say what you like. But if your dissenting voice is sort of from one radio station in Polokwane or something like that, then it's not really effective. So that is really what media capture is, and you need that so that nobody actually unveils, as happened during the effective attempts at state capture by the Guptas. You don't have a media that actually says, no, but hold on, this is what is happening. And in South Africa, that started in about 2008, and we didn't call it state capture then. It was just looking at the misuse of state money to build in Kandla. The real penny that, I think the penny dropped on what one might call state capture, with the use of the Waterkloof Air Base for the Gupta wedding. It was clearly an abuse of the state, clear abuse of the state. And I think the penny started to drop there. And then another thing that stopped media capture and possibly state capture was this brilliant stroke of luck of the Gupta leaks, which gave us this huge trove of information what was actually going on. So Mbongiseni had been writing these stories which pointed to what was going on for quite a long time. We didn't have as much evidence, as much substantive evidence as was supplied suddenly by the Gupta leaks, and people couldn't deny it. So there was a stroke of luck, and there was the other thing that stopped, I think, media capture was a strong tradition of professional, independent media, news media in South Africa. I mean, we know the media isn't perfect. I used to work this, I know how imperfect it is, but certainly we do have a strong tradition in South Africa. And thirdly, a fairly, I would say, not exactly massively profitable, but certainly a sustainable media at the time. And I think that's under threat now, and I think that is the thing we should really worry about, because a weakened media is much more prone to state capture, to media capture. Okay.
Thank you, Reg. So I'm going to open it up now and take comments and questions in rounds of 3. But before I do, I just want to say the one thing we didn't deal with in this book is what happened with criminal justice institutions. That's one glaring omission. But of course, other projects following one from this, as Jonathan mentioned, there's a big project that he and Themba Maseko are leading at Wits University. They are beginning to go deeper and go deeper in terms of disciplines, to dig deeper, to understand this moment we're living through and its precedents, and to understand state capture more fully. So I think Peter was right, this is the beginning, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done to analyze, to understand this moment and how we got here. So with that, can we invite comments? Questions?
Yeah, thanks. Vern Harris, Acting Chief Executive, Nelson Mandela Foundation. So, question to all of you. The concept of state capture, does it not obscure two more important lines of inquiry? The one is, how were our liberation movements captured? And the other line of inquiry is a global question. Has democracy not been captured?
Thank you. We'll take another comment. Thank you. Gentleman at the back, and then we'll come to you, sir.
My name is Rufus. I'm a financial advisor by trade. I think the root of the state capture is when you look at the politicians, you give them power without economy, so without finance. So obviously they will look at some means how to get into that pot. So that is the beginning, that is the root. So I think maybe at the negotiations there should have been some financial way of distributing before you give people power and you have a lot of measures in place whereby all those measures are cutting against them not to touch the pot. So obviously they will create their own means. So that is the beginning of the state capture. Obviously it's formed by the politicians themselves in order to touch the pot. So it's difficult now to say you can arrest all of them because they're all, most of them, they're all involved. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question here, Karim.
Thank you very much. It's Chris Tomorolo here from the ANC in the 117 around here. My question, and I think one thing that has stood up is the role of the private sector. You know, you mentioned your PWS, you know, and all the accounting firms. And obviously, yes, in any corruption, there's a corruptor and a corruptee. But what I'm getting from the book and from the speakers is that there's been a political assault, especially obviously against the ANC, you know, but much more, not less political insult to the PWCs, you know, and the Bains, you know, and the Bains can get away with the fine and it's been done, they go back to business, you know. But yes, there's a corrupt and a corruptee, but not much more insult on them, on an assault on them. I don't know if that book addresses that. Thanks.
Thank you. Can we get responses? Start with you, Devi.
Sure that it's accurate to say, well, no, it's certainly true that there are different levels of outrage and public attention. I think part of that is fair. We have different expectations from people who are democratically elected to represent us and who take oaths to execute those jobs in the state than we do to private firms who, if you are like me, and I'm sure many of us, you sort of will expect that many private actors who are profit-oriented will try to get away with what they can. So there are different standards and there are different levels of outrage. I'm not sure I agree that there's always a corruptor and a corruptee. I don't think there are loads of innocent bureaucrats being preyed upon by evil private sector people. I think these people are often equal partners who work together in these networks in order to achieve a common gain between them. So certainly, I mean, that's the reason we wrote this chapter. More attention should be paid to the private sector. More attention should be paid to the role of professionals. But I do want to say that, like, fundamentally, when we're discussing this kind of systematic corruption and state capture, we're looking at a system where the politicization of the state has reached a point where those with political power can make appointments to ensure that certain people can control state contracting and can control who is awarded state contracts. Now, the procurement budget in this country is massive. There's a lot of money to be earned here. And as long as the sort of systematic problems that we're seeing persist, like those incentives to people operating in the space remain fundamentally unchanged. So we're going to have to address the political system as well as the sort of personal and irregular control over contracting if we want to address the role of the private sector. Then Vern's questions about, are we not obscuring to deeper lines of inquiry? I think often the focus on state capture can obscure those lines of inquiry. I don't think it has to. I think that state capture can provide a conceptual depth when we treat it with care. But certainly I do think, look, the capture of our liberation movements, we've seen in the evidence from the Zondo Commission just how much the history and the historical political conflicts and the internal contestations within the majority party, the effects that that has had on the state and on our political system and on what in the end we might describe as state capture. The same with this global question of like whether democracy is 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 always captured. Well, Marxists will tell you the state is always captured, and we need to make sure that it's captured by the proletariat. So certainly in a democracy, you've got these competing interests that are all competing to control the state. That's something we have to contend with. I think when we're looking at state capture, we're looking at a particularly nasty manifestation of some of the corruption that is inherent in a multi-party democracy that comes from these competing interests lobbying for state power. And I mean, at PARI, a lot of the work that I do focuses on how to shore up those democratic institutions of the state in order to guard against some of those abuses of power. But it's a problem, it's a question that's never going to go away, I think. It's something we're going to be grappling with as long as we're trying to make a democracy work.
Okay, let me take a take as well. So on the point about PwCs and the accountability, so let's look at the title, right? It says State Capture in South Africa, How and Why It Happened. Note, it doesn't say State Capture in South Africa, what it is, right? Because we're actually talking about the definition of the term. It also doesn't say, like, how to stop it, or what to, how it doesn't happen again. I think there are other projects in the fullness, I suppose in the fullness of time as those projects go ahead. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I think other projects may be, I'm not trying to let the corporate wrongdoers off the hook, but I think it is probably fair to observe that the kind of accountability that we would want, we've got to look for it in both short, medium, and long terms. So that's only a partial answer. Vern, so I think as usual, not as usual, but here I want to disagree. So your suggestion is that the term obscures, but in opacity there is sometimes clarity and light as well. So on those 2 points, I think, and I really do think that being part of this book is helping me see that more, that, state capture was a real thing. At least it was a popular phenomenon. We'll all go, our kids can even, say the term state capture, etc. So, so the fact that, so where does that come from? The liberation potential that you were talking about, I think it actually connects it more deeply into South Africa's particular history. Many law students think constitutional history only starts in 1994, but there were episodes before then, and even legal doctrines, etc. So on that side, I think it's a case study that really helps to show liberation in that sense. And then, and I've already mentioned the way in which I think the price, it's worth the price of admission introductory chapter expands the South African studies into African and global studies. So the democracy, the capturing of democracy, what one worries about in the United States, my home country as well as here, is absolutely a part of this dynamic. And it may not be, we may not be specifically looking at that in this book. I certainly wasn't, but I think there's a lot there that we can bring together.
Is it working? On the point of democracy, I think that if I'm looking at media capture, I think that people still value democracy, and that's why authoritarians need to preserve a veneer of democracy while controlling everything behind the scenes. If you think back to the 30s, people were disillusioned with democracy back then, so they just ditched it in favor of dictatorship. You can't do that now, you have to pretend to be democratic. But on the questions of state capture, so when I started that chapter, I thought, well, what is state capture? And it did occur to me that the Guptas, and this is one way of thinking of state capture, is infiltration of the state by crime family at the highest levels. But one version of state capture would have it that the state is, as you say, always captured by someone. But I think what the Guptas were aiming for instinctively is total state capture, and they never really arrived at that. And what we saw was partial state capture. We saw state capture of some institutions like SARS, but we didn't see state capture of Treasury, though there was an attempt, and we didn't see state capture of the Reserve Bank. Now, those two institutions are captured, as they are in Zimbabwe, then you're in real trouble. So I think what you're looking at in some cases where you have total state capture, we're talking about kleptocratic private sector cooperating with a malignant state to rip people off, and also at the same time quell any dissent. So the other part of the media capture thing is it has to be quite comprehensive, and we never got anything near that. There were attempts to control the SABC, serious attempts. I mean, there was some control, but there was an attempt to, at one stage, the Guptas wanted the New Age to take over the news arm of the SABC. They wanted a stake in the Independent, and they didn't get that. They tried to buy Prime Media, or better, they wanted to buy Prime Media, and they wanted to buy the Mail and Guardian. So they had big ambitions, and they never achieved those. Otherwise, we would have seen South Africa moving towards what I think of as actual state capture, which is capture of large, almost the total power of the state for private gain.
Thank you. We'll take one more round. I think we've just got time for one more set of questions. There's one here, Karina. We'll take this.
Thank you very much. Clyde Manninson, a concerned citizen who spends more time thinking about energy than he has. If I remember correctly, there was a word cloud in the state of capture report. And if we think in fonts, I think the word Eskom appeared in the center of that word cloud and caught a lot of us somewhat unawares as to the state of the intertwinedness of Eskom in state capture. I've tried to put a number to what that's cost our economy. And the number I have in my head is that we are sitting at 20% lower GDP than we would be sitting at if we hadn't been thrust into an electricity crisis. And so just to comment on that number at a macroeconomic level, and the fact that we still seem to be embroiled in capture in this particular arena of energy. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any other?
Yeah, hey, my name is Elijah Scott. I'm a PhD researcher at Stanford in the United States. My question is directed toward Devi. You mentioned that one of the elements of state capture is the outsourcing of the state to private entities. I'm wondering, I appreciated some of the other global context and African context of that. Can you place that in the African or global context to see the extent to which that occurs across the world? That'd be really helpful. Thanks so much.
I've got two more here.
Good evening, Norman Gaza. A quote comes to mind. I did not join the struggle to remain poor. And I think that surmises everything. The state was captured before we even became a state. South Africa came into being as a direct consequence of big business putting pressure on the NP government, and at the same time bringing in the liberation movements. And at that point in time, the die was cast. We were set on a path of no return. When we became an independent state, we just walked into the trap that was set before us. We weren't wise enough. We were just caught up with the euphoria of having political power. And only when we got political power did we realize we didn't have economic power. But even worse than that, we didn't realize we weren't empowered as individuals. What did we do? We then got into the Gupta Gates, we got into a whole lot of things. I just want to disagree though with one point that was made. I think we were captured. If you look at the state spend in this country, who are your largest spenders in this country? It would be Transnet, Eskom, SAA. From a state point of view, those are your largest expenditure points. So the Guptas, by and large, had the state wrapped up. The fact that they didn't have treasury and in their books was of no consequence because they had the major spenders already in their pockets. Thank you.
Thanks. John Wright, former history lecturer. Just a question for Jonathan. In passing, you mentioned a couple of times something called the shadow state. It sounds ominous. Could you tell us a bit more about what you've got in mind?
Thank you for those comments and questions.
This is the point that was raised before. This the whole concept of state capture is contested and contestable. And for some people, the state is always captured. There's always private interests who are lobbying the state to do X, Y, and Z. But I think that in the particular context of the transition, I think you do have a point. I think that business did not come to the table as it should have, and did not really take seriously the empowerment of ordinary black South Africans. I used to cover black economic empowerment, and I was witness to some of the attempts by black business, and I'm talking about black business, not black empowered businesses, to break into the economy, and how they were utterly crushed by their white competitors, who had no idea that what this actually meant. So National Salt and Breweries, for instance, was producing clear beer at one stage in competition with SA Breweries, which is a bad thing to go into competition with SA Breweries, and they were utterly crushed. There was an attempt at a Pepsi to bring Pepsi back to South Africa in a big way. I think it was New Age beverages. That was utterly wiped out by Coca-Cola. Once again, it's very difficult to go into competition with Coca-Cola. But there wasn't, to me, a concerted, coordinated effort by, and it is, I think, still largely the white business sector to make some space, somehow or another. There was this sort of half-hearted attempt by Anglo-American to sell Jonic, but there was never any follow-up, and there was, a lot of the businesses reacted to the change by moving overseas. So I take your point, but that's not entirely state capture. If you really want to look at proper state capture, look at places where kleptocrats and oligarchs are cooperating with the state to totally rip off the citizenry, and you can find any number. I think we still have a functioning state in South Africa, and I think we are there. If I look at things like the extension of grants and maybe even a contemplation of a basic income grant, I'm not looking at a completely captured state now. I don't think so. So that's just my opinion.
I'm on a rule that there can be no precise questions from retired Wits history. So, yes, I was alluding to what I think moves along with the content and the form of the book, that it's a historical and a cultural understanding of this episode. And so to give two examples of what the shadow state and the constitutional state would be, I think one, which clearly is in this book, is, and it's one which a lot of, let's just say, first-year law students bring, there's a shining constitutional state. Maybe not anymore in this generation, but nonetheless, the idea that there is a true shining constitutional state. And then the shadow state becomes ominous, just like you said, John. And it's Raman's chapter, Raman Foley's chapter about organized crime, predatory networks, etc. You can talk about that as the shadow state. So that's one. But I do think that there's room in some of the accounts that we're giving here of other possibilities, even for that term. So another distinction would be the distinction between the formal state and the informal state. So a shadow of the state. One example, a sector that I do some work in, public interest remedies in competition law. Those work because business people in those, and their lawyer intermediaries, it must be said, have actually accepted and occasionally go beyond the rule and the letter of the law. It's the informal understandings that are there. So I think that's what I was trying to allude to, that in pointing out that I think there's room and space within this book to move beyond a white black.
Cool. I must admit that I have not done as much comparative work as I would like. That said, certainly the trend of outsourcing, in some contexts more of privatization, is certainly global. And it is something that is closely linked with global patterns of corruption as well. Not in a small part due to the global nature of many of these firms. They operate the same way in many places, and the money often flows to the same places in like tax secrecy jurisdictions, for example. So we do have a repeat of many of these patterns. However, in some contexts, the states there are more capacitated to manage the contracting of some of the stuff that's outsourced. And when we're talking about outsourcing and contracts to private firms, I'm talking in part about professionals, but not exclusively about professional services. There's many other things that are outsourced. But we find that in a lot of the cases in state capture, many of the things that are outsourced are simply never delivered. And there's often no consequences for that, because the function of the state to check that these functions are fulfilled, to check that these projects are delivered, and to ensure that there are consequences when that doesn't happen. The state doesn't have the capacity, or sometimes doesn't have the willingness to do that when they are, of course, cooperating with these private sector firms. And that's simply devastating to a state that is trying to achieve developmental aims. But of course, it's devastating in other contexts too. When you're outsourcing the running of your prisons, for example, which happens in many places in the world, we've seen the kinds of, the consequences of those perverse incentives. So it's a global trend that's closely linked to corruption. I was just in Nairobi last week, and we spoke with their Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, and they also said that about 90% of the corruption cases that they investigate involve large procurement contracts. And as was mentioned by someone in the audience, we have a massive procurement budget, and we see that Transnet and Eskom and SOEs like that are the main targets because they're doing big capital expenditure. Where the professions come into this is often the management of those projects. We saw what McKinsey was doing at Transnet, for example, was financial advisory, transaction advisory. But also from the inception stage, they were doing the studies on what kind of demands we would see for locomotives, for example. So a lot of the decisions that should be made by the state are decisions that are being made by private actors. And when we're looking at what those key decisions are, about like your strategic objectives and the plans for your state, I think that that's something the state ordinarily should not abdicate. So I hope that goes some way to answering the question, but it's a big thing. Quick closing remarks. Some of my best friends are lawyers, but not management consultants.
Let me make 3 quick points. Firstly, in the book, John, there is a conversation in the chapter written by Henny van Vieren and Michael Marchant on the notion of shadow state in the Mexican experience, where drug cartels are effectively a shadow state inside that context. Secondly, I don't think we can have a conversation about the contemporary South African situation without fingering the decision that our future economic policy should be based on the market. Because the fundamental social pathology in this country is white wealth and black poverty. And unless we find a way to deal with that issue, it seems to me there are great problems before us. Thirdly, and this touches on Vern's point, I don't think we can have a conversation about the global impact of state capture and the relationship between business and society without recognizing the rapacious nature of contemporary capitalism. So bring out the Marxists again. We need to talk some more. Thank you.
Thank you. I could say a lot. I've been stimulated in new directions by this conversation. But I'm going to close off with 2 points. The first one is that there's a project that's started, that you're going to hear about soon, that is attempting to now get, to not let these capitalists that made all this money from state capture get away with it. And it's an attempt to try and make them pay reparations into a fund that's going to help to rebuild the state. It's in its early discussions so far, but at some point sooner or later, you're going to hear a lot about it. I was just reminded by the conversation today of an email I received this afternoon to a follow-up discussion. And then the last thing I want to end off on is an invitation to another book launch that's going to happen here in a year and a half. The next book we're working on is on the Zondo Commission. And I think it's going to go some way into addressing some of what Vern was raising. Are we obscuring anything? Perhaps not. And one of the ways in which to begin to open up those conversations about the capture that was talked about of the liberation movements is to talk about commissions of inquiry. And one of the things we're doing in that book is to begin to compare the Zondo Commission to other commissions that have happened before, including the TRC. So you are invited to another book launch. It will happen in a week and a year and a half. And one of the panelists will be Vern Harris. So with that, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you to the Express and to Exclusive Books. Books are available for purchase at the back, so you can do to buy a copy. Please buy a copy, and authors are happy to sign your copy. Thank you.